During the Second World War, a significant amount of motive power was needed to keep the railways of Europe going. For the Allies, this came in the form of 280 goods engines from England and America, these being the Stanier 8F engines and the US Army S-160s. The 8Fs made their mark in the Middle East, and the S-160s are remembered for both their sheer numbers and American style, but few remember there was also a third class of 280 that, sadly, doesn't quite get the same amount of remembrance as its counterparts. By 1942, the war was showing no signs of slowing down, and Britain's railways were in dire need of more engines. Stanier's 8Fs were doing a good job as Britain's standard goods engine, but they were becoming more and more costly to produce. Robert Riddles, Director General of Royal Engineer Equipment, needed an engine that could do the work of the 8Fs that was also much cheaper and quicker to build. He began designing a locomotive based on the 8Fs, and by 1943, his new Austerity engines were put into production. The end result was essentially a simplified version of Stanier's design. Instead of a tapered boiler, the Austerity designs had simple, parallel ones. Instead of a Bel-Paire firebox, which was complex to build, the Austerities had round-topped fireboxes. Where the 8Fs were awkward and difficult to maintain, the Austerities were designed so they could be easily mended with shoelaces and whatever else you had on hand. They were also slightly lighter than the 8Fs, had a shorter wheelbase, cylinders bigger by an extra half-inch in diameter, no boiler lagging, could be converted to burn oil if needed, a narrow bunker to make them easier to drive in reverse, and, most impressively, a higher overall tractive effort than the 8Fs. On top of being simplified, they were also designed to be compatible with the 8Fs too, both having the same sized driving wheels and motion to make sourcing parts and maintenance just that little bit easier. Riddles also produced a 210 version of this design, these having a longer wheelbase, bigger boiler, and wider firebox. The 210s, however, weren't built to be better performers, but rather the extra wheels were to help decrease the engine's axle load to allow them to run on branch lines. 935 of the 280s were built, with an additional 150 210s also constructed. Though the engines were intended for use in mainland Europe, they were quickly pressed into service on Britain's railways, with the London North Eastern Railway alone borrowing 350 to cover for their worn-out Gresley goods locomotives. Nicknamed Aussies by enginemen, the Austerities managed to get the work done, but were found to have their own shortcomings, mostly their fireboxes. The drop gate mechanism often warped from the heat, and the firebox itself was criticised as being too rigid. The tube plates in the firebox were also known to crack, causing many of the engines to fail and have their boilers scrapped after less than 2 years in service. The 210s worked British rails too for a short time, but their long wheelbase made them very cumbersome to handle. Eventually, the Austerities were deployed into mainland Europe in June 1944 to help move troops and supplies, with 20 of the 210s dispatched to the Middle East. They proved invaluable to the war effort, but the Austerities didn't work for long, as by 1945 the war was over and they were no longer needed in Europe. With the War Department deeming them surplus, the LNER was quick to purchase 200 Aussies, having found how much better they were than their current, outdated goods engines. In 1946, Dutch railways, having had a significant amount of their locomotives damaged or destroyed by the war, leased many of these engines to keep their railways going while they rebuilt. 237 Aussies ran on Dutch rails, with 184 making it their permanent home, and 103 of the 210s also joining the fleet, nicknamed Little Jeeps and Big Jeeps respectively. The British-built engines had some problems adjusting to their new home. Drivers had to stand on the left side of the cab, and smoke from the engine caused visibility issues. To alleviate the problem, the engines were fitted with taller chimneys and operated at a lower boiler pressure. They only worked in the Netherlands until 1952, being either sold on or scrapped. 2 of the little Jeeps were sold to Swedish State Railways in 1953, who were evaluating whether it was cost-effective to buy these second-hand engines to replace their outdated rolling stock. Both engines were modified to work on Swedish rails, having their tenders shortened and fitted with closed cabs before being trialled. The performance of the engines, however, was relatively lackluster, and so both were put into strategic reserve. 12 Aussies were overhauled and sent to work in Hong Kong, but little of their service history is known, other than 5 of them were converted to burn oil and 1 of them exploded. Another 16 210s meanwhile were making a name for themselves in Greece, having arrived in 1946 to pull both goods and passenger trains. They seem to have been favoured quite well, as they continued to run in service until as late as 1985. 6 of these were preserved, with 2 of them pulling tourist specials well into the early 2000s. Despite their popularity abroad, Britain seemingly had little interest in the 210s, with only 25 being brought home after the war. The 280 Aussies, however, were very welcome. Along with the 200 already owned by the LNER, the newly formed British Railways took ownership of another 533 280 locomotives in 1948, needing all the engines they could get their hands on after the toll the war had taken on the railways and their rolling stock. The poor condition of the engines, however, meant they needed extensive repairs before they could be put back into service. Slowly, they began working again, pulling freight trains all across the country, and on the rare occasion handling passenger services too. The majority of the Aussies worked along the former LNER lines along the east coast of England and Scotland, with many later spreading out and working around other parts of Scotland too. The 210s meanwhile primarily worked in Scotland, rarely going elsewhere in the country. With their help, British Railways was able to recover from the war and keep things moving, but alas, the Austerities weren't designed with longevity in mind. The engines rode rough, wore out quickly, and clanged a lot as they worked, earning them the new nickname of bed irons or woofadunks from the noises they made. Despite their intended short lifespan, the engines managed to keep working until the 1960s, with the 210s disappearing by 1962 and the remaining Aussies lasting until 1967. Not bad for what were essentially disposable engines, but given that British Railways was moving towards dieselisation, it's likely BR simply decided to keep running these engines into the ground instead of investing in new steam engines that were just going to be replaced by diesels anyway. Once withdrawn, all of the Austerities that ran on British Railways were scrapped. Only one 280 Aussie survives to this day, this being one of the 2 that ran in Sweden, now residing at the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway. In contrast, 8 of the 210 Austerities have been preserved. 3 are in England, 1 at the Severn Valley Railway, North Norfolk Railway and North Yorkshire Moors Railway respectively, 1 is on display at the Dutch National Railway Museum, and 4 remain in Greece, 2 in safe storage while the others are unfortunately derelict. It's a shame really. While the 8Fs and S160s are often credited as the engines that helped pull the Allies to victory, little light is often shone on these machines that arguably did just as much work, and equally a shame that very few were preserved. I suppose we can take some solace in the fact that, despite their shortcomings and disposable design, they managed to work on Britain's rails for much longer than their intended lifespan. So next time you're remembering the war and its many forgotten heroes, take a moment to think of these engines, because after all they did to aid both during and after the war, well, I think they deserve a little remembrance too. Don't you? Subscribe for more.